I'm Rob Pickering, and it's good to see so many of you back after lunch, and everyone looks relatively awake, which I guess is pretty good for this slot, right? Let's see if we can try and keep it that way. So when I was invited to speak at TADHack, and Al and I tossed the title of the talk around, I said I'll go and talk about some stuff about decentralized communication, and I had in mind at the time contextual communication and the rise of WebRTC and all of those things. And on the Aerobus on the way from the airport the other day, I kind of started thinking about this more widely and made this this whole thing a little wider than that. So I apologise that straight after lunch I'm going to talk about the whole thing about decentralized and centralized communication and go back over the 30 years of my time in the industry from writing TCP/IP stacks and goodness knows what. So I'm going to measure the level of glazed overness as we kind of go through stuff. What the heck is centralized communication? Why is my clicker not working? So, how can you have centralized communication? If I'm on the phone in London, talking to someone in Beijing, that's through a relatively centralized system, the kind of public switch telephone network. But I'm talking on a device that's probably different from the device the person's using in Beijing. We're using different operators. The operators probably have different business models. How on earth could you say that's centralized? It's clearly not centralized, it's distributed. So is it not the case that all communication is distributed? Well, no, really, because the way those providers are working, they're working within one system that's got some high barriers to entry. It's got one architecture. It's coming down through the ITU to national bodies who are administering the numbers. And if they're on mobile, then the GSMA are involved. And I know people like James just go and grab themselves a bit of spectrum and light a valley up, and that's kind of okay. But the reality is, for most of the world, there's a bit of bureaucracy involved in that stuff. And I guess you could just say that's the end of the presentation, where there's bureaucracy kills innovation, therefore decentralized systems are better, right? So I sort of had to think about this, and yeah, you could say that, but the ultimate decentralized system is the internet. It was built as a decentralized system. There's all this stuff about being built to withstand nuclear war, and it seeing censorship as damage and rooting around it and all that kind of thing. Slides have gone way too far. But even the internet's got a degree of centralization, right? So even on day one of the internet, there was a thing called the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, and it was one guy, John Postel, and if you wanted a port number or a protocol number to go and do some internet stuff, you had to go and talk to John, and you had to get a number for it. But the reality is that didn't stop anyone doing anything. So there's no centralization that forced people through that bureaucracy. It was just something that was there as a convenience. And that kind of makes a difference. So when does centralization and decentralization thrive? What are the kind of attributes? What are the big wins and the big failures we've seen over time? One of my earliest things that I came across in the industry was this kind of switching from all of these islands of email, and this was probably the real big first enterprise communication shift. Was we had all these islands of email, and there were the X400 folks and the SMTP folks, and then SMTP email came along, and all these silos of communication where if you wanted to talk to someone on email and they were on CompuServe, you had to be on CompuServe. All that went away because we invented SMTP email, and it was the most rubbish protocol on the face of the planet. It didn't take into account identity or any of those tough problems, hence the kind of spam problem we've got, but it kind of worked. And at that point, communication within enterprise exploded because we could all do email to each other, and what a blessing that has been, right? What about decentralization fails? In theory, if you followed the playbook, what should have happened is that XMPP should have come along and we should be working on this big federated messaging system. That isn't what happened. What happened is that we have all these messaging silos, and they all work great. And the reason that they work great is usability. So, you spell your enterprise messaging one of these, probably, and probably a few more there. But they haven't really federated. In fact, a lot of them built federation in and then ripped it out again when they found no one was interested, or they perceived that there were commercial reasons not to federate. So I think you get to the point where the only one of those messaging systems which has any idea of federation built in, I think Skype for Business still has XMPP built into it, or has the ability to talk it anyway. Google dropped it. No one else even vaguely perceives any reason to do it. Okay, so messaging was a bit of a decentralization fail. What about WebRTC? So I got in right at the start of WebRTC, messing around, putting phone calls over it, sending videos to ambulances and goodness knows what. And that looked like it was going to be truly peer-to-peer. So you've got this idea that every endpoint on the planet, if it's a browser, has WebRTC built in, it can do video, audio, you can compile it into your mobile apps, and anyone can talk to anyone with WebRTC. No signaling protocol built into that, so that was going to be a bit hard, wasn't it? But in practice, all the mass market adoptions, WebRTC is massively adopted out there, but it's massively adopted within centralized applications. If you look at all of those messaging apps that I showed earlier, most of those are using WebRTC in one form or another. They're using it for their browser-based pieces, they're using key parts of it, they're using stun turn, and they're pulling bits of technology in, but they're doing it in a centralized way. And you can't say that they're winning because they're decentralized or anything like that. The reason they're winning is because they've got great UIs on them, and the usability has been thought about. So unfortunately, you know, for kind of idealists like me, you can't say decentralization equals network effect, because network effect is the thing that makes communication stuff win, right? It's this idea, the Metcalfe's law, that the value of a network is proportional to the square of the number of participants in the network. Why tiny little networks have no value, and as networks get bigger and bigger, they get more value, and then everyone lands on them. So you can't make that leap that says decentralization equals network effect. You've got to go through the, well, decentralization might actually be better at innovation in some contexts, and that might give you better usability, and then you might get some network effects, so your application might win. Decentralized systems seem to produce superior rates of innovation, kind of. It's not even a given, and I guess, you know, my thesis is that centralized systems are great for control and stability. Decentralized systems seem to produce better innovation. Why are centralized systems sort of a little bit worse at innovation than decentralized systems? Well, it's this kind of rent-taker problem, isn't it? If you give one party, if it's a group within your organization or a standards body or whatever, the role of producing a centralized database or controlling the system, it's going to be very well controlled. And you know, they're going to justify their existence and make a very stable job of doing that. But they're not going to make it better, faster, cheaper. Unless you've got very strong control and inputs on that. Generally, better, faster, cheaper tends to happen when you give access to new entrants in the market, and the better, faster, cheaper innovation tends to come from the new entrants. And if you're building an architecture with centralization, a centralized rent taker, you know, it's kind of like this. It is a rent taker, that's bad for me. I'm a rent taker. Actually, that's pretty good for me in the short term, except it's probably going to kill my own innovation, so that might not be great for me. But generally, it's not great for the whole market as a place, is it? So if we can eliminate those central choke points on the networks we build and the applications we build, the theory is, or my theory is, that you effectively innovate a bit better. There's a downside to that. Centralized is relatively easy to architect. If I'm building a central application, I don't really need to care too much what's behind the curtain. I can throw an API on it to keep developers happy. But everything else that's going on inside the application, you know, you can take a Windows server-based application, paint a front end on it, and so long as you can figure out a way to scale it horizontally, you can make a killer application out of that. Lots of counting systems and things like that that are hosted as centralized systems seem to manage to do very, very well at that. Decentralized systems, on the other hand, have to solve a lot of tough computer science problems. So they have to solve problems around identity, securely distributing state, and robustness in the face of all possible inputs. If I'm going to architect my system as a set of microservices, and I'm going to give access at all sort of levels to that, and I'm going to allow federation within the system I'm architecting, I need to be a lot more careful about the way that I'm controlling that, and the way that that happens at an architectural level. And another problem with building decentralized systems, if you're going to let anyone build a front end on it, is that you don't control the user experience. So it's hard to hit with that really strong user experience. And I kind of look at this in as for messaging systems. So, for example, there are lots of really nicely packaged messaging systems out there, and they're relatively easy to implement on a network. If you go and buy into one of those large enterprise messaging systems, an average IT administrator can sign up and get going with that. Something like Matrix is an insanely good idea, right? Has anyone tried to set up a Matrix home server, for example, for their organization and try and run it? Yeah, they're great for you and me, but the packaging around it, the stuff that actually makes it beautiful and makes it work. When we build these decentralized applications, we don't tend to be too good at making that stuff work. It's harder because you're solving real hard problems and architecting them. I think things like Matrix are going to be great when the packaging's there and when we manage to make them something that can be rolled out beautifully by an average IT administrator and get the user experience there. Ultimately, that kind of innovation can only be built on decentralized systems. You can't take the sort of the Office 365 or the Google Hangouts front end and make something better on it. There isn't enough of an API on there to do that. Ultimately, anything where we talk about decentralization, blockchain comes up, doesn't it? And up to the last few years, there was sort of an insoluble problem that stopped us pursuing full radical decentralization. And it was generally around this idea that there are a set of dynamic truths in any application that everyone that implements the totality of the application has to agree on. So static truths are rather easy. So there's sort of the IANA style truths of, I need a port number for the thing I'm implementing, I need to document a protocol. It's just a little bit of drawn out design work at the start of the implementation. It's relatively easy to get people to agree on those static truths, the constants. Dynamic truths, things like how much money is in a bank account, who controls a phone number, they're much harder. What you typically end up doing for dynamic truths in any system is you build a database and you give someone control of that database. And of course, at that point, you've found your central rent taker again, so your innovation possibilities are reduced. Blockchain actually helps us solve this problem by allowing a distributed consensus. That's what it really does. It's just a distributed ledger. It's just a way of saying, more than 51% of us agree that Fred has 10 quid in his bank account, so Fred probably has 10 quid in his bank account. Where's the current blockchain practice, and how does this translate on how we can use it? So it can be revolutionary. It's certainly got the potential to be revolutionary in environments where we've got to have a distributed application agree on a central authority or ledger. It probably isn't actually needed if you're building a private application. I hear a lot about private blockchains, but actually, if you've got the entire authority within your organization to sign an amount of money or agree a truth, you don't really need a blockchain with a distributed ledger to do that. But let's assume that it's being used in an application in the distributed case. There are still some issues with blockchain, and still some issues with public blockchain that really need solving, and they're really quite fundamental. So the current proof of work, the idea that the way that I mine blockchain and the way that I participate in the consensus mechanism is based on the amount of fossil fuels that get burnt in order to generate the energy, which is what I'm proving my worth with, is insane. It kind of reminds me of when we found radioactivity in the 20s. People were selling radioactive chocolate bars because they were good for your health and making radioactive lipstick. It is on that scale of idiocy that we're doing proof of work by burning fossil fuels with everything we know about climate science. It's absolutely bonkers.
Can you hold that slide for long enough?
Yeah, go back. Yeah, there you go. Blockchain is the radium chocolate bar of the of the decade. Okay. Transaction rates on the main public blockchains are absolutely useless. So if you look at the transaction rate of Ethereum or Bitcoin relative to, say, the Visa network, there are many zeros difference in that. And underlying all this is this 51% problem that if you can control 51% of the mining activity, 51% of the signing activity, you can rewrite history and empty everyone's bank accounts. Okay, that was very depressing, wasn't it? And I'm sorry about the chocolate bar analogy for people who've got a genuine stake in blockchain technologies. Things can and will move on. We have to move with blockchain technology onto proof of stake. And that overnight makes all of the energy consumptions and the kind of profligate use of resources go away with that. And it's moving really to proof of stake whilst maintaining that defense against 51% scenarios, which is the thing that's going to move blockchain on. Having said that, there are some very big applications of blockchain that's in the wings that are very real. Like, for example, in the UK, Ofcom are running a trial with using blockchain technology to control or to be part of the mechanism for number porting, which is a huge issue all over the world and especially in the UK. And blockchain is an absolute perfect technology for that, because the idea of a distributed database of truth of ownership of telephone numbers so that we don't have to anoint one great big provider in the middle somewhere to take rent of taking days and charging money to move numbers around, or the current situation where it's distributed within range holders is an absolutely superb application of blockchain. And on-chain and off-chain transaction rates will improve. So, my gut feeling at the moment is you're building enterprise applications and looking at decentralized and looking at blockchain to do with, to use for this, then play with it, look at what it can do for you. But if you are actually looking at, Marcus's demo this morning of doing the OTP on public blockchain, and I kind of sat and looked at that and thought that's so cool, that's so neat. But if you look at the big issues with that, the pinch point on transaction rates, it took a long time for those two transactions, and there's the gas fee and all of those things. And I was quite relieved when the final slide came up of, yeah, there are some issues here. And I think those issues are fairly well understood. So racing into blockchain today and saying we're going to implement particularly on public blockchain and it's going to be the solution to all our problems, I don't think anyone is actually crazy enough to do that. But it does solve one of the big problems of decentralization, which is this idea that we have to anoint a central rent-taker database owner who then kills innovation. So, in wild summary of everything that I just said, if you want to get rich, actually building a centralized service can work pretty well because it'll allow you to concentrate on the UX without worrying about people distributing that. Build decentralized services if you want to avoid the hazard of centralized rent takers in the architecture. But actually, it's probably going to take more work, and that work might be better invested in UX design in the first place if you're actually, your goal is global domination. And yeah, blockchain is going to be a big technology going forward, but if we use it today, all of the drawbacks that I talked about on the radium chocolate slide are going to cause us some problems.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rob. Do we have any questions for Rob? I have to admit, excellent presentation.
I'll stun them into submission.
No, I'm not sure. Just we're going to warm them up for a little minute. we had a keynote at the start of TADHack Global given by one of the founders of Ethereum. And I love their open and honesty. I mean, very inspirational keynote. And he made it clear, this is a research project. He stated that. Didn't say that this is basically sort of commercial, big time. This is a research project. So I think, what you're saying here is very much aligned to the honest promoters of blockchain-related technologies. So I think, and presented, I think, from a very pragmatic viewpoint. So well done there, Rob. Over to Dean.
I generally agree with pretty much everything you just said, but a question as to whether the answer, the opportunity isn't around blockchain-based services, but around blockchain-based sort of back office infrastructure for things like managing, wholesale interconnect billing, or as you say, number portability, or various other sort of the machine rather than the customer-facing service aspects.
So we're talking between multiple organizations, so things like carrier settlements and all of that kind of thing. Yeah, it is, and that is the opportunity. It's where we need to establish a multi-party consensus of stakeholders, where those stakeholders go in and effectively electing a central clearing authority is going to slow down their ability to innovate in that billing process. Yeah, so yes, I think there's a lot of potential there.
Any other questions from the audience? If not, again, Rob, excellent presentation. Thank you for taking the time.